invitation to present here, and thank you all for the very interesting discourse thus far. I'm sure we'll be continuing to do this as the days proceed. The talk today will dive into a bit more of some of the principles around complex systems and how they can be used to integrate some of the notions we talked about in terms of constraints. Not so much causality, but more in terms of how we think about how constraints provide ways to communicate how dynamic systems evolve. One of the people that's really been essential for this work is really Lauren Ross, who could easily be in this room right now. She's done a lot of work on causality and explanation of biological systems. And she and I worked a lot on this part of this paper. The other person, Victor Yersa, is probably, I'd say it's his fault I'm here in some respects, because a lot of the work that we've done in complex systems and the application to the brain really comes from work that Victor pioneered. Lauren's threw up some books. I'll throw up a few more books just to fill out your library. John Holland, book on the far left there, has written some excellent and very accessible books that cover different aspects of complex systems. One which is complementary to Max's presentation, Signals and Boundaries, actually talks about how to think about how complex systems are organized in terms of how signals propagate between levels, but also how boundaries provide some constraints in terms of how they act on one another. One of the most inspiring books I saw recently is this book called Aid on the Edge of Chaos. And it's an interesting book because it's talking about aid in terms of financial aid, and how the model for financial aid is assuming sort of a linear system. You put money back in, things will start working again. You give some examples of how that's failed miserably in Africa and other countries that have been getting financial aid from first world nations. But what he does is he kind of walks through, if you think about the challenges that are happening economically and otherwise in some of these nations, perhaps it's something more to do with a nonlinear response to impoverished utilities, impoverished resources. And approaching this from a complex system perspective actually allowed some new innovations in terms of how to deal with some of the challenges some of these countries had. For example, they actually had a really good example of where they partnered between computer scientists, engineers, and farmers, and building a complex system framework to allow farmers to evaluate the allocation of resources to improve the yield in farms, and actually using a complex systems model to do that and putting it in sort of like a game, which is extremely cool. So, and most people have probably heard about the book on the bottom right, Gödel, Leschler, and Box from Douglas Hofstadter. It's a huge book, but it is sort of like the tome, if you will, for a lot of complex systems thinking. So if you can get through it, go for it. This is my dude slide. Pretty much everything I'm going to talk about is in this slide in some one way or another, and it's actually trying to convey some of the concepts. In addition to being, I guess, a scientist in some capacity, I also play music. So sometimes it's helpful. I actually research music as well, but I also play. And I find that sometimes it's nice to convey these concepts in a different kind of frame. So I'm going to use music today as one framing to sort of help get across some of the ideas we're trying to convey. You can think about this as a three-dimensional manifold. Manifold being a space that contains things that can happen. And things that can happen here are actually notes. These are notes from the Western chromatic scale. So it's more than 7 dimensions because there's sharps and flats and pieces in between. And what you see in that sort of manifold is energy, how much energy there is in particular notes. And so the manifold itself is providing a possibility of constraints. It's providing boundaries. It's saying this, anything outside this constraint is impossible. We don't have a K note, for example. We have a G note. Yeah,
so the energy here is related to the frequency of the notes, or is
you'll see in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, so we have the sort of, the hard constraint is this sort of the boundaries of what the notes can be. The soft constraints are sort of how the notes can progress. So there are progressions that are sort of keys that most of us who, again, are familiar with Western music understand. And those are kind of soft constraints, and those can play a bit more. There's much more flexibility. So we have hard and soft constraints that tell us how we navigate this manifold. And that manifold contains what you think of as a possibility space. What are the possible configurations that are that can be actualized in this space? And that possibility space can change as things evolve across time. And that you'll see. So let's actually see what that sounds like. You might know the song, maybe not. This is an old song. I'm old, so it's an old song. What we see happening is the energy in the different notes comes up and goes away. These are basically chords that are coming together. So you see possibility space being explored now in this song. And obviously this possibility space can change if we change the songs, but the overall constraints, the boundaries, the hard constraints don't change. What changes is how we navigate that possibility space.
What are the small? Why are there like small capital and small major?
Those are
Major and minor.
Yeah. So this slide was provided by my partner in crime and music, all things music, Sarah Faber. Some of you probably know Sarah.
She's great.
Yeah. So she likes to do these kind of things that make stuff accessible. And also it's her fault if you've not had an earworm for a particular song. So again, getting back to this is, again, we have a boundary. The boundary is a hard constraint. Within those boundaries, we have soft constraints. Soft constraints can move around. That carves out a possibility space. Possibility space can change as the process evolves within that space. So again, this is a manifold. We can flow across the manifold. That's the navigation of possibility space. And this is a way of thinking about, for example, how the brain might be organized and how it enables this navigation through possibility space. So, this paper is on the Google Drive. Lauren was the lead on this. It's published in the European Journal of Neuroscience as well. I think it worked out fairly well. It is my first paper with a philosopher, so it was fun to write. I got a good appreciation for how important each word is. So in my usual day job as a psychology PhD, I typically kind of over words, but when Lauren is writing stuff, it's extremely precise, and I got a good appreciation for that. So let's see what we're going to talk about today. So motivation behind this notion of possibility space. It stems from an idea that Victor and I have been working on, hidden repertoires, and connects with the philosophy of science literature. We'll talk about hidden repertoires first of all, and then possibility space. Why the hell should we care? And we already know this answer to the last question, so I won't go there anymore. Hidden repertoire. This is an interesting phenomena of complex systems that I thought I had discovered, but I realized that most things in science is actually wrong. I'm just rediscovering something that someone else discovered 50 years ago, or I guess 40 years ago, because 50 years is too long. No, wait, that's not right. It could be more than 50 years. Anyway, this is a paper that Victor and I put together that comes from Victor's idea of what are called structured flows on manifolds. So getting back to that music manifold, there's a structure in there, and you can flow through that. So structured flows on manifolds are how one navigates these very complicated spaces that we represent in terms of attractor dynamics and things of that sort, moving through hills and valleys in the manifold. And in this paper, the data point that I used to think about a possibility of a hidden repertoire was some work that Victor had done on epilepsy. And this is a really good example of bridging between a complex systems framework and being able to apply it to a very important problem. What you see on the top here is a trace from a cell in the rat hippocampus that's showing seizure activity. As a matter of fact, if you were to put an electrode in an elephant hippocampus that was seizing and a human hippocampus that was seizing, it would be basically the same trace. So this pattern is quite reproducible across most vertebrate, as far as I know, species. You show this to a dynamical systems person like Victor, he says, oh, that's actually a fast and slow process, where the slow process enables the fast process. And everybody goes, what? How did you know that? I said, well, it's obvious. Okay, I trust you, Victor, on that one. How do you actually then model that? Well, what you can do is you can take this and put it out in two processes. The fast process is just basically showing spikes. Okay. And the slow process enables the spikes to happen and then shuts it down. So this is kind of getting back to a comment I made earlier about slow and fast processes, and slow processes can actually be the constitutive framework that allows things to happen across levels. So if you take this and make it a phenomenological model where you've got a spike that happens, that would be the seizure, and as a slow process changes, it basically shuts it down, and as it moves across and changes its value, the fast process gets enabled again. You have this spike in activity. And you can put that in sort of this phase plane diagram where you've got change in this slow process or slow variable that traverses across this way. You have what's called entry bifurcation, which is a change in the dynamics of the system. You have a spiral attractor, which is this thing here. And as this value in the slow variable changes, it shuts off the seizure activity and then cycles back through it here. Okay? Extremely simple model. All it does is show this spiking activity, but it's actually remarkably useful. As a matter of fact, this phenomenological model was the basis for a clinical trial I just finished up in France called the Epinov clinical trial. This is a quick tangent, saying that this was a large collaboration amongst many people in France, many hospitals in France. And what they did is they used a model using a platform called the virtual brain. Virtual brain is a generative mechanistic modeling platform. So it's basically generating data based on biophysical parameters. So in this particular case, it's excitability of tissue, but you can actually model, for example, excitation inhibition in cell populations and use that as a generative model. So you're generating the data that you're observing. In this case, you've got data from the patient. You've got their structural information. You've got their connectome derived from diffusion tensor imaging, for example. You've got also recordings from stereotaxic EEG, where you've got electrodes implanted in the patient and measuring activity. And then using the virtual brain, you simulate that data to identify where is the seizure focus. And that information then goes back to the neurologist or the neurosurgeon to make the decision on how to proceed. So this is a really good example of taking that whole generative modeling approach that Max has talked about yesterday, also we've been talking about, and then taking it to a point where it actually can be useful. In this case, it's actually part of the clinical trial, which I think is a good outcome for this kind of modeling approach. I played a bit more with looking through the work that Victor and group has published. And this was a paper that followed up from the first part of the epileptor model, it's called, and exploring the broader dynamic range of the model. And so this part here I showed you earlier, where you've got change in the slow variable, you've got the spiral attractor, you've got spiking activity that generates and goes back. If you keep on moving this slow variable input further, what ends up happening is that there's a qualitative change in the system. Instead of showing the spiking activity, it shows this very slow oscillatory behavior. When you show that behavior to somebody who's researching epilepsy or even a surgeon, they say it looks like status epilepticus, which is not a good thing to have happen in the patient. But what that means is that this repertoire that's in this model is there, what's hidden. It's not necessarily going to be enacted. As a matter of fact, hopefully it won't be. But it is a repertoire of the model, but it's hidden until certain kinds of conditions are actually met. In this particular case, this change in the slow variable. Slow variable probably has something to do with calcium. We don't actually know right now for sure, but that's the supposition. And also, a sidebar, interesting thing about this is it suggests that the way to get out of status epilepticus is to change this Z variable. So instead of continually dampening the system, which is typically done for status epilepticus, you actually want to increase the excitability. So they have some confirmation animal models, but they haven't kind of followed that through yet. So again, a very good example of being able to use these generative models to provide guidance in terms of how to treat disease. So this gave me the idea of a hidden repertoire. Again, the repertoire is there, it's possible, but may never be enacted. As a matter of fact, in some respects, actually all respects, epilepsy is something we can all show. It is in fact a repertoire that we can show given the right conditions, but we typically don't. So again, in some respects, you can think of epilepsy as a hidden repertoire as well. So I presented some of this work and talked about hidden repertoires as being sort of, I would call it almost the ubiquitous property of complex systems. And I presented this on a virtual webinar. Lorette is not here today. Lorette, who's a long member of McGill, organizes these very nice online webinars. And I did a presentation, and on the presentation, one of the people who was questioning me, this is kind of like a PhD examining committee, was Lauren Ross, a philosopher, who was saying, hey, this stuff about hidden repertoires is very similar to ideas about possibility space and constraints and explanation. So this idea of having an exploration and these hidden repertoires are sort of constraining how that exploration happens is very similar to some ideas around possibilities and so on. I said, okay, let's talk. So we talked. And that was the outcome. The possibility space paper was in fact the outcome. So when we think about a system, complex system that has extended manifolds, if you will, those manifolds carve out constraints, hard and soft constraints, and a possibility space. So the notion of a possibility space refers to the available states of a system, even if they're not currently or often realized. You can't really see the top part of that graph very well. There's a version I'll show you later. A possibility space in terms of graph representation, you can think about it in here, in the bottom graph that has the nodes and edges. The nodes and edges could be, for example, anatomy. So those are possible connections that can be enacted but need not be enacted. But those are possible routes that could happen in terms of how different nodes in that system interact. And you see there are hard and soft constraints. There's no connection directly between these two nodes, for example. It's a hard constraint. It's never going to happen, at least not in a system's lifetime. So certainly in the brain, we have a way of thinking about constraints. Hard constraints, in some respects, you can think about anatomy providing that, although anatomy does change over the lifespan and can change for plasticity, for example. But anatomy doesn't provide essentially some fairly rigid boundaries, at least over some time periods, in terms of what areas can interact with one another. And essentially it establishes kind of the rules of potential interactions. And the rules can be enacted as you start navigating this possibility space. And those rules will change as the system evolves over time. Kind of getting back again to the little music audiogram earlier, whereas the music evolves, we're in a certain key, and therefore certain notes do not get played unless you're playing a different kind of song, or jazz, some dissonance, for instance. But as the system evolves, the possibility space changes. Hidden repertoire. So what is that now in the context of the possibility space? Lawrence mentioned symmetry. Actually, one of the things that's an important feature of complex systems is that symmetry breaking enables more causal architectures. If you have a completely symmetric system, not much you can do other than kind of go on and off. As you break symmetry, then you have more dynamics emerging. And that breaking of symmetry is something that happens as the system evolves. It evolves over evolutionary time or evolves over developmental time as well. So a hidden repertoire, and this is what's written here, arises from the distribution parameters underlying state space. State space is how parameters manifest in a complex system. State space could be firing rate, for example. how these enable configurations that are possible but seldom actualized. So for the brain, for example, there could be functional configurations that are possible for a given architecture, but may not be visited. It could be, for example, redundant, or shown to be inefficient in terms of behavioral outcomes, or potentially even maladaptive. So as the system develops, for instance, you could have this structural architecture manifested. And then as the system gains more experience, you'll have different kind of functional architectures indicated by the arrows there. And one could be hidden. It could be enacted at some point in time, but never get used after that point as well. So that's setting up sort of a causal architecture for what is possible. And some of those possibilities might never get enacted, as basically ends up being hidden. There's other ways of representing the potential of how systems can interact. I'm going to borrow some work from my colleague Giulio Tononi, who some of you probably know. And this is just showing what happens if you change the connections, the structural architecture of the system, and what's possible here. The difference between the grid system and the map system here is the grid system has connections within this layer. You can see it between here, whereas the map system does not. If you map out the way different areas can interact, you've got a huge line of possibilities in terms of the areas that can interact at a given point in time. In the grid system, the map system is fairly impoverished in terms of the possibilities that it can enact. And that's a hard constraint in terms of the way the architecture is set up. And then this reflects the possibility space within those hard constraints. You can even expand that more, and this is an interesting way of representing that in terms of actual cortical anatomy. And this is just basically the number of possible connections that can be enacted. In cortex, you see it's different in cerebellum, that's an anatomical constraint, and it also changes in dreamless sleep. So again, this space expands or contracts depending on the state of the system, and also expands or contracts depending on what's actually flowing through the system at that particular point in time. This is not unique to the brain. This idea of possibility space, it wasn't called that when Waddington proposed this epigenetic landscape in 1947. But what this is meant to confer is this notion that you've got a primordial cell of some sort that goes through this developmental landscape. And it can take various trajectories, these trajectories of possibilities that it can enact as that particular cell matures. And that's a way of representing this possibility space in terms of epigenetic, which is kind of cool. And there's an extension of that that was published, several publications from this fellow Shui Huang in Seattle, that shows that as a system, in this particular case, these epigenetic systems, gene regulatory networks, I should say, as they evolve, because they are complex systems, because they show dynamics, there will be repertoires that will be carved out, they'll be there because of the complex system framework, but may never be enacted again. And you can represent these as attractors or parts of this landscape that have high probability, that allows you to put sort of a Bayesian inference framework on top of that. And you can also express them in terms of used and unused attractors. These unused or seldom used attractors have implications for the system. At least that's the theory right now that Huang is suggesting. One is that if these unused attractors are visited, they could actually result in tumor genesis, so maladaptive use for a hidden attractor. Hidden attractors in the brain, you could have seizures happen, for instance. So a good sort of connection there. In this particular case, there's also supposition that these unused or hidden attractors could actually also help with evolution or adaptation. So through either through environmental pressures or something of that ilk, or just natural evolution, you may have these hidden attractors getting used and all of a sudden have an emergent behavior that actually ends up being more adaptive. And that gets instantiated in the system. This notion of hidden repertoires is not something that's unique to the brain. It's actually something that's a property, if you will, of a complex adaptive system. Yeah?
In this case, the hidden repertoire would be the unused attractor?
Correct.
Yeah.
I really encourage you to, if you can get this paper, it's open access. It's published in Bioessays.
We'll put it in the,
Yeah, it's
OneDrive.
the best part of the paper is actually the appendices, because it does go through sort of the implications for this in terms of dynamical systems theory, but also in terms of things like evolution and tumorigenesis and so on. So let's talk about utility now. Like, why is it helpful to have these ideas to make it help us understand more sort of the properties of dynamic systems and the properties of the brain in particular. I'm going to go through three examples. One is adaptation, and this has to do with the fact that complex systems are continually redefining possibility space. They're always active. Different levels, of course, depending on how much coffee, but they're always active. And that supports adaptation, testing the waters, if you will, testing possibilities. Second part, that's sort of a flip side of adaptation, is resilience. That by having this possibility space, some of which never gets visited, could in fact confer more resilience to injury or degradation. And the last part is the phenomenology that, and this is a bit of a leap, but I think it's probably has some legs, leaping legs. That variations across configurations may result in different experiences. So the actual phenomenology of experience is in fact the exploration of possibility space. Let's walk through that. Adaptation. I do like to use examples of phenomena that span systems. And one of the things that I thought was quite remarkable is this notion of an adaptive immunity, obviously in the immune system. And here, what happens is that the immune system will tend to generate more antibodies than are necessary for antigens, just to have them available, essentially, should an antigen come in that has not been encountered before. So it overgenerates possibilities, if you will, repertoires, motifs, and when it encounters that, it will adapt and generate more antibodies for that particular antigen. But it has this repertoire to choose from that's already there. So it helps the system to adapt very quickly to new pathogens in the environment. Does that happen in the brain? Is there an overgeneration of functional motifs, for example, that can be modified slightly or engendered for different kinds of potential behaviors? Turns out possibly, yeah. So a really good example comes from some of the literature on hippocampus and replay or pre-play of memory. So a lot of people know about the observations that happened a long time ago, where you have the hippocampus seemingly replaying memories at night, for example, or other times of the day. And it's replaying in the sense that it's not as if you can actually read out the neuron trace and say, oh, that's a memory of a television show. It's actually the trace that happened that was consistent with what the animal in this particular case was doing at that particular point in time. So it maps out the firing pattern or functional connections. Those functional connections related to a certain kind of behavior that the animal engendered, and that gets replayed later when the animal's sleeping. That literature kind of had some wrenches thrown in there. So for example, one of the ones was finding that some of those patterns that seemed to get engendered for learning were there before the animal learned. So it's almost as if the animal knew that I had to learn that, so I'm going to generate this beforehand. So you have this kind of weird thing that the animal kind of jumped forward in time and then came back. And it's like, well, how do we deal with that? So some recent work from Paul Franklin and Gina Jostens' lab in Toronto suggested that these may actually be representing functional motifs that were there before the animal encountered that experience. And they're just basically there to be tested to see whether or not they're useful for a particular kind of behavior that the animal encounters. So they found, in fact, that there are several functional architectures that were there prior to learning, some of which were close to being useful, some of which were not. And as the animal learns, certain functional connections that were proven to be better for learning were the ones that maintained themselves across that time. But it was already there. They're just getting it now utilized to improve the resilience or the adaptable capacity of that particular behavior. So again, it does seem that in order for the system to adapt rapidly, it increases its possibility space. And then it hones in on which part of that possibility space is important. So again, possibility space can change as the system moves forward in time. Okay. So the flip side of adaptation is resilience. Complex adaptive systems have what are called degenerate manifolds. It's not a personality quirk. This is actually a mathematical statement. So degenerate means that the dimensionality is actually lower than the actual number of elements that are in the system. And what that means is you can have similar or same emerging behaviors supported by somewhat different configurations in state space. So you have manifolds that are sort of invariant translations that go from parameter space, which is basically how fast the neuron's firing, to state space, which is how it gets enacted. And that translation has some degeneracy in it, which is good, actually, because that means if you have a broad possibility space that engenders similar behavior, that means you can lose part of it and still maintain the behavior. And that's the idea of degenerate manifolds here, is that I can go in this particular, this is a degenerate manifold where you've got the same parts in parameter space leading to the same behavior in state space. And if I knock out a couple of these nodes, it doesn't really change the capacity of the system to show that behavior. Obviously, if this is smaller, and I knock some neurons out or knock some nodes out, I will then affect the system. But the broader this degenerate manifold is, the more resilient it is to perturbation. Excellent. This is another representation of that slide from one of Victor's papers. Again, you've got state space manifolds with parameter translations here that allow one to sing, for example, allow one to walk. You can knock out parts of this state space because it's a resilient manifold and still have the behavior preserved. And that's really the idea between further possibility space in terms of resilience by having, I won't say sufficient, but I can't think of another word, sufficient possibility space that allows one to have a resilience towards perturbations. Now, this resilience will in fact differ across individuals, and that's probably a really important thing to think about, is how do I then measure resilience in an individual and see if I perturb them somehow, are they able to either show no response or recover those responses? And that's an example of how the system then adapts, for example, to some perturbation as well. And certainly resilience can be related to other concepts that are creeping around the cognitive neuroscience domain. In cognitive aging, for example, there's this notion of brain reserve or cognitive reserve. The term was introduced initially by Jakob Stern. He is in Columbia, I believe. Carol Barnes is in Arizona. Cheryl Grady was in Toronto, and now is retired and now is hanging out in New Zealand. But they all looked at this idea of brain reserve, cognitive reserve, and trying to find a way of sort of framing it so we have some commonalities in how people approach the notion of cognitive and brain reserve. I'm not going to go through that highlight, but it's just worthwhile knowing that there's a connection now, a nice connection between the idea of cognitive reserve and resilience and adaptation. The work I had done with Cheryl and other colleagues when I was in Toronto, there were some early clues that there might in fact be some notion of resilience that's part and parcel of, we'll say, healthy aging. This is a particular example from an imaging study of young and old individuals, young being the typical university undergraduate population, around 18 to 35, old being not all retired professors, but some were, people between 65 and about 80. And the task that we had them doing was a task that shows no change in behavior in healthy aging. That's a visual short-term memory task. This is very abstract visual shapes, and you find that the performance is in fact the same between young and old, but the functional networks that underlie statistical performance were quite different between the two groups. Now, we didn't have any way of measuring a young person as they get older, so I don't know if that change in fact was reflecting resilience manifested in an individual, but suggests that there are possible configurations that can change, and those changes enable that particular behavior to maintain itself as people grew older. I talked about earlier today, I made the comment about time. And one of the things that's quite important in terms of complex systems is space-time structure. And again, it's not unique to the brain, but it is something that's a feature that's worth keeping in mind when one thinks about systems that have an architecture that's like a complex system. So sparse connections, local connections stronger, distal connections further, and then dynamics that span space and time. And how that space-time structure is navigated changes. And those changes can either be adaptive or maladaptive. And the particular case we're talking about now is actually that in healthy aging, there is in fact a change, and that change can be adaptive or maladaptive. What I'm showing you here, it's called an adjacency matrix. Basically, it's just a matrix of telling you where certain nodes are connected. So it's a 38 regions. It's a symmetric matrix. And a dot just tells you that those two regions are connected anatomically. If you take those connections and rescale them by the distance between the two regions, you get what's called a space-time structure. So areas that are quite close to one another can propagate signals around 2.7 milliseconds if you assume some sort of constant conduction velocity. And as we move across time, you see that certain connections are more likely to be enacted at, for example, 18 milliseconds, and then fewer at 26 milliseconds. This now tells us that this possibility space has a space and a time aspect to it as well, which is important to take into consideration. So complex systems have this temporal structure, and it really is that space and time confluence that's critical in thinking about how the system is operating and how that changes. So you can measure, for example, things is a very mathematical term. Things squared, things cubed. Things that represent, for example, how information, in quotes, would be captured at various time scales and spatial scales. One of those measures is entropy. We've used a metric called multi-scale entropy, which measures what's called sample entropy, which basically is the similarity metric. And it changes that counting term as you change the temporal scale. So as you get to slower and slower scales, the entropy measure will change across that space. Here are some artistic interpretations of a lot of data that show changes in multiscale entropy measured with EEG or MEG. In healthy adults, children, this actually extends all the way down to kids about 6 months old. Older adults that were healthy and older adults at risk for cognitive decline. So the adults in green, you see their entropy curves sort of peak in the middle, which is roughly around here. And then it starts to show a decline in terms of entropy. The children, the whole thing is just sort of lower. Now, that could be a combination of hyperconnectivity, but also the fact that a lot of these aren't completely myelinated yet, so they're not completely used. So overall, the entropy goes down, and you'll see that as kids mature, a lot of what actually happens is in this middle range in terms of increase in entropy. Time scale is basically talk about it in terms of frequency. So it's not exactly the same, but it's probably the closest analogy I can think of. So time scale number 1 would be fast frequencies. Time scale 14 would be slow frequencies. It will roughly translate, because of the biophysics, to what you see in that extruded matrix. It's not going to be a perfect one-to-one correspondence. And so you'll find, for example, that when these connections are inactive, these ones that have shorter time scales, it tends to be at a faster frequency, higher frequency, which would be more in the finer time scales.
Yeah.
Whereas these connections, when they get inactive, will tend to be at a slower time scale, which will involve more of this part. But it's not a one-to-one match, but it's sort of roughly how they translate. Older adults that are healthy for their cohort show an interesting pattern where they have increased entropy at a slightly finer scale here, so in and around here, but then show decreased entropy at a coarser scale, which is kind of interesting in terms of preserved cognitive function. Why? No idea. There's a lot of models now we're looking at that suggest why this might be happening, but right now it's just basically an observation of a phenomena that we have no clear explanation for. Older adults at risk for dementia. These are the people who have mild cognitive impairment, or people who have actually show no impairment but transition to having cognitive impairment. I think it was 3 years later. Will have no change at this fine scale, but maintain high entropy at a coarser scale. And that's almost, I won't call it a biomarker, but we're with amongst friends, so I will call it a biomarker of potential cognitive decline. So this act is an important, from both a data perspective, but also thinking again about possibility space and how that navigation happens and how you can quantify that navigation in terms of a relatively simple measure called multiscale entropy, which you can actually measure from a single electrode. So it has some potential in terms of translation that way. Oops, okay. That's just the tagline, exploring dynamic repertoire or possibility space, is another way of saying that. And just to wrap that part up, certainly it's the case that you can elaborate the quantification of space and time, and this is a paper from Joanna Cabral and colleagues using resting state functional MRI and looking at network states and their transitions in terms of their probabilities of transition between different functional connectivity patterns using a technique called LIDA. What you find is that the navigation of the space-time structure does in fact relate to cognitive status. So for example, older adults, this is a large neuropsych battery that we've done. These are all, again, ostensibly healthy for the cohort. The good people showed a certain preferred propagation through the state space, whereas the ones that were showing worse performance showed a different pattern of propagation through state space. So again, it's the importance of how one navigates this space-time structure, how one navigates possibility space. That's the embodiment of the cognitive process potentially as well. I made that statement purposefully, the embodiment of the cognitive process, because that's the next slide. So I'm paying attention to my own slides to say, make sure you say that right. Okay, I just said that. So now we get to phenomenology, and this is the tough one. I'm not going to use the word consciousness because I don't think that's helpful in terms of conveying what I'm trying to say here. The diagram you see there is showing really simple manifolds for a photodiode. Ernest is his name. And this person here who bears some resemblance to someone else in this room. It could be you or me, I don't know. What you can have happen, for example, in this particular instance, is present a light to Ernest and to the human in a dark room. And both the photodiode and the human will detect that light by some behavioral measure. And you can see this projector, if this is the repertoire of the photodiode, this is the attractor, and that attractor is instantiated, the photodiode goes to 1, that's as opposed to a 0, and that means that the photodiode detected the light. Human does that, no problem. I put this other attractor here to indicate that there are other things that the human can perceive, can experience, besides that light. So for example, if we change the light to being a red light, the photodiode will just light. The human will say light, oh, and red. And if I do that, the photodiode will just say light. The human will say light, red, and it clicks when it comes on as well. But the other part of that is there's a larger space of things that could have happened in that human's experience that the photodiode will never experience. So the human knows that this is not a banana. It knows that it's not, there's no puff, there's no taste to this particular thing. It doesn't experience that, even though it's a possibility. So that the experience of the human exists on the realm of all possible things that could have happened as well. And that distinction between what's currently happening and what could have happened is really the heart of the phenomenology for the human and how it then differs from Ernest. So Ernest will never know red light. It will never know the taste of banana. It'll never know wind, for example. All it's ever going to know is that 1, 0 on off for the light. The importance of being Ernest is that it will respond very fast.
That was a long setup.
So Ernest will be faster responding. The human will take a bit more time because it's going to be a bit sure that we actually get to that attractor. So it'll be a bit more dwell time, if you will, before the human will respond. The human will respond. So again, our current experience exists in the concept of what is possible. And that's getting back to possibility space as a way of thinking about phenomenology, how we experience our world, is what has happened, but also what could have happened. Possibilities. There's various anecdotes of how this can play out. One of my, say, favorite is a condition called hemispatial neglect. It comes from, more often than not, damage to the right parietal cortex, usually from a stroke. And what ends up happening in this patient is the left space does not exist for them. And it's not a sensory deficit. It's just not there. It's not possible. It's not part of their universe anymore. They can't even imagine there being a left space. And depending on the severity, if you talk to that person and mention that, well, there's a whole other half to your world, they look at you like you're crazy. No, this doesn't exist. It's impossible. It's no longer part of my possibility space. It now becomes a hard constraint in some respects. Some people do recover. Some people learn how to adapt to that. But the notion there is that that part of that possibility space is gone. So that phenomenology, that idea that there is a space out there, for them it's not there anymore. So the phenomenology changes quite dramatically.
Are you talking about people, for example, that suffer a stroke?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's usually from stroke. You can see in some neurodegenerative disorders, but it's not as common. I think also from like all the traumatic head injury as well. But, so this is the last data slide. The idea that how one navigates possibility space can relate to other features that we measure that capture capacity comes from this work that my colleague Petra Ritter and colleagues have done in Berlin, where they took the data from the Human Connectome project and constructed individual models in the virtual brain. The Human Connectome project is a massive data collection exercise that's still going on. It started off with young, healthy adults. It was collecting structural and functional MRI data both resting state, which is basically laying in the scanner and waiting until you get out of there, and also some task data as well. And it's been posted and openly shared, either processed or unprocessed. And now it's been extended to kids and healthy adults, as well as a longitudinal component as well. So it's, somebody was mentioning, who was this mentioning about data, a lot of data available, it doesn't have task in there, and it's kind of saying like, why aren't you using this data? Well, it's resting state data, there's no task involved. So there are some problems with that.
David Berry.
Yes, right, David. That's the problem with human connectome data, is that there's no task. There are tasks in there, but it's not necessarily a task that you would choose. It's a task that they chose. Anyway, this particular paper used those data to look at models of decision making and relating the model, or actually the navigation of possibility space, or the navigation of the manifold based on fluid intelligence. And what they found was that people who had higher fluid intelligence, they had a different way of navigating this possibility space. They've actually spent a bit more time exploring possible attractions before they actually responded. And this is it's a delayed match the sample task, so it has some working memory component to it. This is the attractor space that they're navigating as well. Now this is, again, we don't know how it is reproduced and so on and so forth, but this does suggest that, again, possibility space can relate to cognitive capacity insofar as fluid intelligence is a good measure of cognitive capacity. But I think it's a good example, again, of how possibility space can be used to encompass this idea that the navigation of this dynamical system space, these manifolds, does have consequences for the cognitive capacity, but also the cognitive performance per se. All right, so I've been blathering on for almost an hour. I apologize for that. Actually, I don't. It's my fault. They gave me an hour, I'm going to take it. So these are things we're going to try and work on next. What are the conditions in the brain that lead to the formation and realization for hidden repertoires? What are the determinants, architectural, secondary, response to pathology, for example? Are some of the symptoms that one sees, for instance, in dementia and acquired brain injury, results of damage per se, or, for example, liberation of the hidden repertoire that's not adaptive, for instance? How much of that's determined by environment and social cultural aspects, or the theme here? How do we explore them empirically? How do we model them? And this possibility of merging things like structure flows and manifold and free energy. And then why are they there? For example, is it in fact, can we show the CMB where it's important to do longitudinal studies that adaptation and resilience and our unique experiences in fact captured through this notion of this possibility space. So this is the exploration part. Some of this I said before, but really the idea is that we can use the generative approach in virtual brain with free energy to look at how we optimize the flow through this parameter space to state space to the actual behavior of the system as well. So it's having a criteria to know how to navigate that, which would be free energy, but also structure flow and manifolds provides the architecture to know what that space looks like. This slide sort of captures a lot of the themes that we've covered over the last thing and a half, and really reinforces that brain function, brain health, brain resilience is more than just the brain. And you can represent it graphically like this. You can also think about this in terms of how we want to try and model it. And this is something Maxwell talked about, something we're working on as well, is that there are temporal and spatial scales that have to be traversed. And we haven't got a good way right now of doing this because it can get quite complicated in terms of time delays and so on, but it is possible to do it. It's just that we have to be a bit more courageous about trying to do that and use that to understand the impact, for example, of social architectures on cognitive systems. We're hoping to move towards that with a new project that we're ramping up, and certainly As this comes together, we're happy to do collaborations as needed. Basically, it's a trailer with a portable MRI and some wearable devices that we're going to take into the community and work with the community on doing neuroscience projects. Much in the same way that I gave the example of working with farmers to decide on how to best optimize resources to improve crop yields. We can use, I think, this platform to start having discussions on how best to work with the communities to understand their unique challenges, get some data from them and with them, and then use that to create models that help better understand their concerns, but also how they might be able to overcome those concerns. So the idea is we're working with some indigenous communities, just Lillooet community, which is north of Squamish, for example, working with them on how their community deals with dementia. And so the perception of dementia is quite different between the Western communities, as you might imagine, and different indigenous communities. So the question then becomes, if we work with them to identify how do you, first of all, identify dementia, how do you deal with dementia, what do we want to measure in terms of understanding the impact of dementia on the elders in the community, who are the ones obviously going to be affected. But how do we then make sure that you don't lose the social importance of having the elder in the community, that the elder's status is still there, for instance. So we're having those discussions now. Modifying the measures that are used, because the measures that are used for cognitive assessment are obviously westernized, so coming up with an indigenous framework for measuring cognitive function. Doing that both in terms of the actual assessment, but also working with them in terms of what might be measured. Brain activity, actigraphy watches, things of that sort as well. The important thing here is that they're the ones that are going to benefit, or have to benefit from this. We benefit, of course, because we can publish papers, but that's not really what we want to do. We want to try and have impact and help them. So that's one example. We're going to do the same with other remote communities that are having problems. There's an example of some groups in Ontario doing that as well for remote communities where we've got concussions from work-related activities that they typically don't get followed up. But by having some remote follow-up, you can actually then improve their outcomes by having cognitive therapists tailored to them. So that's sort of the example. Okay, that's it.